Once upon a time, in a kingdom where snow fell like cold ash, blanketing the world in silence, a queen sat by her frost-covered window, stitching a tapestry of crimson and white. The needle pricked her finger, and 3 drops of blood bloomed on the cloth. She whispered a wish to the biting winter wind, for a child as fair as snow, with lips as red as blood and hair as black as ebony. The wish was granted, but the queen did not live to see the child grow. The new queen, her stepmother, was beautiful but vain. Her beauty, bound to a mirror of dark origins, became the core of her identity. The mirror, forged from secrets and sorcery, whispered truths she could not escape. It promised power and eternal beauty, but it demanded her envy as its price. As Snow White grew, her stepmother watched her with an unsettling gaze. At first, the queen doted on her, dressing her in fine silks and teaching her the ways of the court. But with each passing year, Snow White's beauty blossomed, and the queen's affection turned to bitterness. Snow White, unaware of her stepmother's growing resentment, sought her approval constantly, bringing her flowers from the forest and singing songs to lighten her moods. For a time, they lived in fragile harmony, though cracks in the queen's facade appeared more often as Snow White's radiance eclipsed her own. One day, the queen's envy overcame her. Standing before the mirror, she demanded, "Who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror's voice rippled through the chamber, soft but mocking. "Snow White." From that moment, the queen's envy festered like an infection. She sent Snow White into the woods, ordering the huntsman to carve out her heart. But when the man faltered, overcome by the girl's innocence, Snow White fled deeper into the forest, her breath hitching as the trees closed in around her. Snow White ran until her legs gave out, collapsing at the base of a moss-covered tree. When she awoke, she found herself in a small, crooked cottage nestled deep in the woods. 7 pairs of eyes peered down at her, belonging to 7 dwarfs who lived there. They were wary at first, questioning who she was and why she had come. Snow White, grateful for their kindness, explained her plight, how her stepmother had sent her away, and how she had nowhere else to go. The dwarfs, though gruff and cautious, took pity on her. They allowed her to stay, provided she helped with the chores and respected their rules. Snow White proved herself quickly, cooking hearty meals, cleaning their cluttered home, and filling their days with her cheerful songs. Slowly, the dwarfs warmed to her, and the cottage became a place of joy and laughter. Snow White, for the first time in her life, felt truly safe. But her happiness was not to last. Back at the castle, the queen demanded answers from her mirror once more. "Who is the fairest of them all?" "Snow White," the mirror replied, its voice colder than before. Furious, the queen disguised herself as a peddler and ventured into the forest. She carried a ribbon laced with dark magic, designed to steal Snow White's breath. When the queen arrived at the cottage, Snow White, trusting and kind, welcomed the old woman. "Try this lovely ribbon," the disguised queen said, wrapping it around Snow White's waist. As the ribbon tightened, Snow White gasped, her vision darkening. She collapsed, her body limp. Believing her dead, the queen returned to the castle triumphant. The dwarfs found Snow White lying on the floor and quickly loosened the ribbon, reviving her. She told them of the peddler, and they warned her to trust no strangers. But the queen was relentless. Her next attempt came in the form of a poisoned comb. Again, Snow White succumbed, and again, the dwarf saved her just in time. On her third attempt, the queen crafted a poisoned apple, its crimson skin flawless. Disguised once more, she offered the fruit to Snow White, who hesitated but could not resist the old woman's insistence. One bite was all it took. Snow White fell, her lips red but her breath gone. This time, the dwarfs could not revive her. Heartbroken, they placed her in a glass coffin, unable to bury her beneath the earth. They carried her to a clearing in the forest, where sunlight and moonlight alike seemed to caress her face. Seasons passed, and Snow White lay untouched by time, her beauty preserved but lifeless. One day, a prince stumbled upon the clearing. His heart ached at the sight of her, and he asked the dwarfs about her tale. Moved by her tragic fate, he vowed to take her back to his kingdom. As the coffin was lifted, a shift occurred. Snow White's chest rose, a faint breath escaping her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, and the prince's joy overflowed. "Snow White," he whispered, taking her hand. "You're safe now. You're awake." But her gaze, unfocused and distant, drifted past him. "Who are you?" she murmured. Her voice was soft, hollow, as if she spoke from a place far away. The prince's heart sank. "It's me. I saved you." Snow White's eyes flitted to the forest's edge, her expression serene, but devoid of recognition. She said no more, retreating into silence. Though her body had awakened, her soul seemed to linger elsewhere, unreachable. The prince refused to accept defeat. He brought Snow White to his castle, where healers, scholars, and magicians examined her. None could explain her condition. Though she walked and spoke, her memories were fragmented, her emotions distant. At night, she stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the dark woods beyond. "What do you see?" he asked one evening, desperate for a response. "The forest," she murmured. "It calls to me." The prince's desperation grew. He searched for remedies, traveling to distant lands in pursuit of answers. Each failed attempt chipped away at his hope. Snow White's waking hours grew fewer, her moments of clarity briefer. One night, she spoke again, her voice trembling as though dredged from a deep abyss. "I dream," she said. "What do you dream of?" he asked, leaning closer. Her gaze turned to him, dark and empty. "A voice. It says I don't belong here." While Snow White slept, her mind wandered a realm of shadows. In her dreams, she walked through an endless forest, its trees blackened and twisted. The air was thick with whispers, voices that seemed to echo from the mirror itself. "Snow White," they hissed. "You are ours." She glimpsed her reflection in the dark pools scattered along the forest floor. But the face staring back was not her own. It was the Queen's, her lips curling into a cruel smile. "Do you understand now?" the reflection said. "This is where you were always meant to be." Snow White's voice faltered. "I don't belong here." The Queen's reflection laughed. "Oh, but you do. You're mine, child, forever." Unbeknownst to the prince, the shattered shards of the Queen's mirror still held fragments of her power. Travelers who ventured too close to the castle spoke of seeing their own faces warp in the reflection of the ponds and windows. Servants whispered of shadows that moved where none should be. In the depths of Snow White's dreams, the Queen's presence lingered, feeding on her fragmented soul. Each time Snow White awoke, Her body grew weaker, as if something unseen drained her life away. One morning, the prince found Snow White unresponsive. Her breaths were shallow, her skin cold to the touch. He called for the healers, but they shook their heads. "She is slipping away," they said. The prince knelt beside her, his hands trembling. He recalled the words of a healer from a distant land. "The curse is tied to her soul. To break it fully, you must give up what you hold most dear." He thought of his journeys, his sacrifices, his love for her. But as he looked into her serene, lifeless face, a dark realization crept in. The Snow White he loved was gone. What remained was an empty vessel caught between life and death. With a heavy heart, the prince whispered, "I will let you go." The dwarfs crafted a new glass coffin, one reinforced with runes to protect Snow White from decay. They returned her to the forest clearing where she lay untouched by time. The prince visited often, leaving flowers and speaking to her as though she could hear. Over time, his visits grew less frequent, until one day he vanished entirely. The forest reclaimed the clearing, its trees closing in around the coffin. Travelers who strayed too far into the woods spoke of a pale girl lying in eternal slumber, her beauty haunting and her presence unsettling. Whispers carried on the wind. She does not belong, but she will never leave. Far away in the ruins of the queen's castle, the mirror's shards still glinted in the moonlight. Their whispers faint but insistent. Snow White's tale passed into legend, a story told in hushed tones. And though centuries passed, the forest remained dark, its secrets buried but never forgotten. Thank you for joining us in the world of Twilight Fables. If you enjoyed this tale and want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe and hit the notification bell for more.